Hi, everyone. My name is Chanel Haston. I am the Director of Outreach and Community Relations for the Elakha Alliance. Thank you so much for joining us today on your lunch break for this very wonderful presentation, Reintroductions and Other Conservation Translocations with our special guest, Dr. Philip Seddon. I'm going to give a brief overview about the Elakha Alliance, pass it on to Andy Johnson from Defenders to give a little pitch for him as well, and then we will let Phil take the lead. So who is the Elakha Alliance? If you're not familiar with our organization, we are a nonprofit based in Oregon. We were informally organized in 1999 by the late David Hatch, who you can see there on the left. He was a Siletz tribal member and realized sea otters weren't on our coast anymore, and that led down a road of questioning and activism, and his momentum lives on today, and we were formally organized as a nonprofit in April of 2020. So I like to say that we're a small nonprofit making big waves towards sea otter reintroduction. We are a small staff of 2 individuals, myself and Jane Vicari, our executive director, and soon to be 1 more coastal community organizer. We're about to start the process of hiring. And we have a wonderful board of really fantastic individuals who you can check on our website. They're fantastic backgrounds. So that's just a little bit about us. And Elakha is a Chinook classic word for sea otter. So that's where we get our name from. Our mission is to restore a healthy population of sea otters here on the Oregon coast and help make our marine ecosystem more robust and resilient. The photo on the right there is me scuba diving off of Redfish Rocks, which is off of the Oregon coast, the southern coast, and you can see the kelp hold fast right there, kind of munched on by sea urchins, which is a problem. And a big part of why we want to reintroduce sea otters here is because we have a shifted ecosystem. So 2 key predators that eat sea urchins, which eat kelp, are missing. And that started with the maritime fur trade over a century ago that hunted sea otters to local extinction here in Oregon. And then in 2013, 2015, we had a marine heat wave, which was the likely cause of sea star wasting disease of sunflower sea stars, which were huge predators of urchins on our coastline. So now resulting is what we coin as urchin barrens. So urchins are repopulating with nothing eating them and eating all of the kelp forests, which is a huge problem for our marine ecosystem here on much of the Western Pacific. So ultimately with sea otters, this is a picture in Monterey Bay where they currently have a beautiful amount of sea otters. And this is ultimately our dream for the Oregon coast to be plentiful with a beautiful bull kelp forest once again. So that was a really quick wrap up, but if you're interested in learning more and following our efforts, please follow us on social media. You can sign up for our newsletter. We send out once a month, so you are up to date. You can do that through our website. And I will pass things on to Andy.
Great, thanks, Chanel, and welcome everyone. Glad to see such a good turnout. I'll just give a brief overview of Defenders and we'll get to the talk. So Defenders' mission is, as a national nonprofit, we're dedicated to protecting all native animals and plants in their natural communities.
Next. Oops, you muted yourself.
Yeah. So I just wanted to mention a couple things. One is Sea Otter Awareness Week, which takes place in September every year. This year it's September 24th to 30th. And there's a link there. Not much on the link yet, but we'll start populating that with events and activities as they become available. And then if you want to get extra sea otter news, we have our little Sea Otters Facebook group. We'll post these in the chat so you can access the links. It's usually weekly or a bit more often than that. We'll post information about sea otters, what's going on. A lot of it lately has to do with this topic of sea otter reintroduction. Next. And currently we're working on a project that's funded through the California Coastal Conservancy, and that money comes through a tax contribution fund that California taxpayers contribute to. And this project we're calling Conceptual Planning for Southern Sea Otter Reintroduction. So we're trying to do a lot of the groundwork to decide whether, whether we should proceed with reintroduction and then how that might transpire. So obviously we're working closely with the management agency, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, who will ultimately decide whether something like this proceeds. And we're working closely with the Elakha Alliance and other partners to make sure that sort of we have a regional view, regional perspective of reintroducing sea otters so that we do the best we can. And now we'll get on with it. So we have lucky to have Dr. Philip Seddon with us today. Let me bring up the quick bio here. Dr. Seddon is a professor of zoology, so I can't even say the word, professor of zoology at the University of Otago in Dunedin, New Zealand, and he's a member of the Conservation Translocation Specialist Group with the International Union for Conservation of Nature. His research interests include pest species, spatial ecology, seabird ecology, and reintroduction biology. And he's worked and advised on species restoration projects in New Zealand, Australia, Japan, the UK, the US, Canada, and Saudi Arabia. He's one of the authors of the 2012 IUCN Reintroduction Guidelines, which many of us pay a lot of attention to. And he chaired the IUCN's working group that produced the 2016 De-extinction Guidelines. He's published over 200 peer-reviewed papers and contributed to over 30 books, including co-editing Reintroduction Biology, Integrating Science and Management, which is sort of one of the Bibles of reintroduction biology. So Phil is a world authority on reintroduction biology, rewilding, and de-extinction. And it's our privilege to have him join us here today to discuss reintroductions and other conservation translocations. So Phil, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Andy. I'll just share the screen. Okay, I hope everyone's seeing that okay.
Yes, we see it.
All guys here. Well, thank you for having me. It's my very great pleasure to be with you this morning. Here from wintry New Zealand. I'm not sure where people are from who are watching, but I'm sure it's probably warmer than where it is at the moment. We've got some snow on the hills. People have been kind of moving and releasing animals for conservation benefit for quite some time. And what we've seen in the last couple of decades is it's really grown as a conservation tool. But it's happening in a world that's changing. So there are new challenges. Climate change is challenging. There are biodiversity losses are challenging. So using these movements and releases as a conservation tool or a restoration tool runs up against a lot of challenges. So what we've seen is really an expansion of the kinds of things people are doing under this idea of translocations. So we're seeing a sort of an increase in the range of activities that are out there. What I'd like to try and do over the next half hour or so is really give you a bit of a background of the history of reintroductions, where that's come from, introduce the idea of reintroduction biology, the science behind it, present to you the conservation translocation spectrum. So that's the kind of range of activities that are out there. Think about how this fits with things like ecological restoration and rewilding, and then bring it all together at the end, I hope, and try and put otter reintroduction or otter translocation within the spectrum and try and see exactly what it is that you're proposing to do. I've mentioned a number of terms, so we probably better have some definitions just to set us right. So the overarching term is translocation. We define this like humans moving things from one place to another and then releasing them. So there's free release. And you might do this because you want some kind of conservation benefit. So a conservation translocation is this human-mediated movement of living things with release somewhere for conservation benefit. We'll burrow into that in a little more detail. The first reintroduction, if you like, was done over 100 years ago, and we can go to Louisiana for that. So this is Ed McElhaney of Hot Sauce fame. He was a member of that family, but he was a keen birder, keen amateur naturalist, if you like. And way back in 1895, he actually founded a bird refuge. He called it Bird City. It's a wildfowl refuge in Louisiana. And he started captive breeding snowy egrets. Snowy egrets were in rapid decline because of the feather trade for hats back east. And he's actually credited with some of the first reintroductions of species, and actually maybe saving the species from extinction initially. It's really interesting that almost exactly the same time, right on the other side of the world, closer to where I am at the moment, there was a translocated Irishman called Richard Henry. And he was a warden of a nature reserve in a small island in rugged fiordlands, so right down in the south of the South Island on the west coast. And he was keen in the wildlife around there. He was spending time looking at wildlife on the island and wildlife on the mainland. And he was dismayed to see the decline of native birds, iconic species like the kakapo, a rather strange nocturnal flightless parrot, and kiwi. And these birds were declining because there was an invasion of exotic stoats from the east. So he took it upon himself to try and rescue these birds, and he caught an incredible number, over 700 of these birds, moved them from the mainland onto this offshore island to try and protect them. So this was also one of the first conservation translocations. Unfortunately, the island was too close, the stoats could swim across, so that ultimately failed. A little over 100 years ago, a bit over 100 years ago, was the first, what I call institutional reintroduction. And again, come back to the States. And it involved bison. So bison declined from something over 40 million animals in around the 1830s to only about 1,000 by 1884. It was a bunch of concerned citizens formed the American Bison Society and started to plan for the restoration, the recovery of bison. And in 1907, there were 15 bison were released from Bronx Zoo into a reserve in Oklahoma. They became the founder herd for the restoration of bison. And the project's really interesting because even though it was back in 1907, you could hold it up today as an example of a really well-designed reintroduction. They'd done careful habitat selection, they'd done pre-release health screening of the animals, they ensured they had community support, and they had corporate and media backing to really support them for this. It's a bit of a hiatus after that, but some high-profile projects through 60s, 70s, 80s, things like golden lion tamarin in Brazil, peregrine falcon, North America, and Arabian oryx in Oman really raised the public profile of reintroduction as a conservation tool. This last project in Oman was headed by a man called Mark Stanley Price, who was the founding chair of the IUCN, so the World Conservation Union's SSC, which is the Species Survival Commission part of that union. And he founded the Reintroduction Specialist Group back in 1988. He was also author of an influential book called Animal Reintroductions. And he used his experience with the Arabian oryx in Oman as a case study for that. The early mission for the Reintroduction Specialist Group was to combat loss of biodiversity by using reintroductions as a restoration tool. And one of their first serious outputs was this little blue document. It's only about 10 pages back in 1998, called the IUCN Guidelines for Reintroductions. Speaking to Mark, he admitted that he and a staff member put it together over a cup of coffee one morning. And it was really just sensible things that they'd encountered in dealing with a number of projects around the world, things to think about as moving forward. we've seen an explosion of reintroduction activities that really increase in the taxonomic and the spatial extent right throughout the world. In this next figure, if you just look at the map on the bottom, so the circles and the numbers there are really proportions of reintroductions around the world. And you can see down in Australia, New Zealand, Oceania, we're doing a lot of activity in this area, but also plenty going on in North America and Europe, and actually growing also in other parts of the world where the biodiversity challenges exist. Just as a matter of interest, up in the top right corner, there's an interesting graph there. So the dark bars are the proportion of species translocated amongst mammals, birds, amphibians, and so forth. And they're contrasted with the pale bars, the open bars, which are the proportions of species in nature. And really the take home from this is that there's a taxonomic bias that exists. We tend to focus on those charismatic species, those vertebrates, mammals and birds, and we don't do as much on things like amphibians and fish as we should, and hardly anything on invertebrates, even though there's more invertebrates than anything else out there. I think this is changing, though. We're seeing many more kind of amphibian, reptile, fish, and invertebrate reintroductions and translocations. Some of the early work looking at reintroductions found that actually the success rate wasn't great. So a couple of studies were done, one in 87 and another revisiting the same data set in 93, found that the failure rates, maybe over half the projects were failing. And there's a number of reasons why that, they suggested why that might be. Part of it was that there was an awful lot of reintroduction activity going on that wasn't very well planned, wasn't very well organized or executed, and it wasn't very well informed by the science. So what we started to see was the development or the emergence of a discipline of reintroduction biology. This graph just shows a kind of exponential increase in publications relating to reintroductions. And it comes from a chapter that I wrote with Doug Armstrong in this book, if you might like to have access to that. So Reintroduction of Fish and Wildlife Populations. We really set out sort of a history of reintroduction biology. The other book, and Andy mentioned it, that we were involved with was this idea of reintroduction biology, integrating science and management. And it was really making the point that good science informs good management, and the two really shouldn't be considered separately. So reintroduction biology in the broader sense is really any of the science around understanding and improving our ability to restore or recreate populations of species. The RSG's undergone a few changes over the years. One of the significant ones was to revise those guidelines. So instead of that little blue booklet back in through 2011, 12, and I think publication came out in 2013, produced a completely new, much more comprehensive set of guidelines, and called Guidelines for Reintroductions and Other Conservation Translocations. And it was really, the title really recognizes that there were some other things, other kinds of translocations, apart from reintroductions, that we need to think about. At the second International Wildlife Conference, held at Lincoln Park Zoo in Chicago, and just before the world went crazy. One of the other changes was we actually changed the name of the group. So it became the IUCN SSC Conservation Translocation Specialist Group to recognize this kind of broader remit, more than just reintroductions. IUCN loves kind of word soup things. So we've become the IUCN SSC CTSG. So if you ever see that around, that's way to unpack that one. What I want to do then, I've talked about reintroductions, I've talked about translocations, I've said there are a whole range of other things. What I want to do is present to you the translocation spectrum. And really, this is a way to ask and answer a series of questions to try and figure out what kind of project it is that you're doing. So the first question you'd want to ask is, you're releasing something, is this release intentional? Did you really mean to do this? Because there are accidental translocations. You think things like rats stowing away on ships, human-mediated movement, it's free release, but it wasn't planned at all. We're interested in things which were intentional. So we can ask the next question saying, well, why were you doing this? What was the main reason why you want to do this? Was it to improve the status of that species that you're moving around, or maybe to restore some sort of natural things within that ecosystem? And the answer to that might be no. Actually, we don't really care about these conservation outcomes. There's a whole lot of other reasons why people move and release animals. This isn't a comprehensive list by any means, but you could imagine things like problem animals, that you want to take them from one place and release them somewhere else so that they don't create that problem. A picture there of penguins is a penguin rehabilitation station in South Africa. So taking oiled seabirds and rehabilitating them and releasing them, not necessarily always back in the same place. There may be religious releases. So in large parts of Southeast Asia, you can gain credit for releasing animals, for liberating animals. And different temples have ceremonies where people will have gone out in the days before and collected a whole variety of land and marine or freshwater animals, bring them to the temples. People come there and they pay a small amount and they can release those animals. Some terrible releases happen under this, like marine fish into fresh water and things like that. They're not really well planned at all. Animal rights liberation, the example there is mink, releasing them. The strangest one I've seen, that photo of the bat. So it's bat bombs. And it was an experiment that was done during World War II, where they took some bats from Texas and moved them to California to start experimental releases. And the idea was that they would tie small incendiary devices onto the legs of the bats and then drop them en masse over Japan. The bats would fly down and go under the eaves of the wooden buildings and chew off the incendiary devices. Fortunately, this was never implemented. We're not interested in these other things. We're interested in doing conservation. So we're doing a conservation translocation. This is where we're sitting. So our next question is, where are you releasing these things? Are you releasing them into their indigenous range? And the definition of that is really where you suspect or know that they used to be on the basis of historical records, which might be written, they might be oral histories, or other kind of physical evidence. So you think about the historical distribution as the way to think about it. You could go, yes, we're putting them back where we know they used to be. We're doing a population restoration. And then you can ask the question, well, are there any of this species still in the area? Are the conspecifics still there? Possibly there are. And so what you're trying to do is then reinforce an existing population. The example here is the world's most endangered wading bird, not far from, just inland from where I am at the moment in New Zealand, the khaki or black stilt, once went down to about 23 individuals. And there's a captive rearing program that is reinforcing the existing wild population to kind of keep those numbers up. So you might be doing reinforcement to increase the population size, to increase the genetic diversity, maybe to change some sort of demographic parameters. You need more males or females or young, older individuals. On the other hand, there may be none of them there. They may be completely extinct in that local area. So what you're doing is a reintroduction. You're moving them back into that indigenous range from where they disappeared. Another New Zealand example here, a bird saddleback. This one went down to about 36 animals on one offshore island because they're very vulnerable to predation back in the 1960s. And there's now probably over 1,200 birds in different reserves around New Zealand through a series of reintroductions. Talked a bit about habitat and moving and getting this right. We'll just take a slight diversion and just think about what habitat is, because people tend to think of habitat in terrestrial sense anyway as being maybe the vegetation. But in fact, it's much broader than that. And here's the kind of more formal definition: that species-specific complex of interacting physical and biotic elements or components including other species. So it might include the predators and the competitors. You want that sort of set of things that favor the persistence of that population. So there are two things that are very obvious. Habitats vary over different areas, vary spatially, and environments change over time. And that change creates a real problem for us when we're thinking about restoring things, because we say, well, restore to what? The problem is you might have new threats, you might have changes in community composition, and of course you might have climate change. So in terms of new threats, again, New Zealand example for us, our biggest challenge is that we have a whole lot of introduced species. So the Australian brush-tailed possum, but also mustelids, cats, rats, just to mention a few. So they've completely changed the habitat suitability of large parts of New Zealand where our endemic species just can't survive where these are present. Community composition might change. An example is seabird islands, where seabirds in great abundance are really conveyor belts of oceanic nutrients onto the land, and they create a kind of nutrient flux. You get an invasive species like rats or mice, and they wipe the seabirds out. You cut off that conveyor belt of nutrients. You've completely changed the system, the composition there, and it might not even be able to be recovered. And of course, we've got climate change, and really does that change everything? We're seeing changes in temperature, things are getting hotter, things are getting drier, sea level rise, and along with these things come risks from increased disease, vectors of disease, things like mosquitoes moving into new areas, in other invasive species expanding their territories, this phenological mismatch where food resources might not be available at the time of peak breeding. And this creates a lot of problems for very specialized species. An example from Australia, Queensland mountain endemic, the golden bowerbird, lives up in the highlands. And as the land warms through climate change, it's in the process of kind of falling off the top of those mountains. But it can't access the cooler southern areas because there's a lot of hot lowlands that lie in between there. Ordinarily, some species are able to naturally colonize new areas as these become available. Not an option for the golden bowerbird or for a number of other species in these kinds of situations, find themselves stranded in increasingly unsuitable areas. What to do then? What's the solution? A few years ago, a group of fairly influential ecologists proposed a solution. They said resource managers must contemplate moving species to sites where they do not currently occur or have been known to occur. So moving them outside of range, these species that can't naturally colonize things, maybe we should be assisting that colonization. So a pretty controversial thing to suggest. There's a lot of backlash against that from the invasion biologists, because we know the problems of invasive species. But we can come back to our spectrum and we can say, well, we're doing a conservation translocation. Is the release in the indigenous range? And we go, well, no, it's not. It's for conservation purposes, but we're moving them outside of the range. So we're doing a conservation introduction. And if our aim is, well, why are you doing this? Well, it's because that population would go extinct if we didn't do something like this. We didn't find suitable habitat outside of range. We're doing this assisted colonization. Another definition by Ricciardi and Simbeloff, a couple of invasion biologists who have been very critical. They called this translocation of species to favorable habitat beyond their native range to protect them from human-induced threats such as climate change. And the IUCN didn't specify climate change as necessarily being the threat. It said intentional movement and release outside of that indigenous range to avoid extinction of populations at any scale. It turns out in New Zealand, we've actually been doing assisted colonization for a while. We just haven't been calling it that. So you think about kakapo again, our flightless parrot, incredibly vulnerable to predation by mustelids, rats, cats, the whole suite of predators. They only survive because we've been what we call marooning them on predator-free offshore islands where they wouldn't have naturally occurred. So we've been assisting their colonization into kind of those suitable habitats. Cross over the Tasman to Tasmania, out of Australia. Similar things happening in response to Tasmanian devil facial tumor disease, which is a very strange socially transmitted facial cancer that's been affecting populations in a big kind of wave from the northeast. And a number of years ago, they moved devils from the mainland of Tasmania off to Maria Island to create a disease-free population of devils. But they'd never naturally occurred on Maria Island. And so they were moving them into appropriate habitat. You could call that an assisted colonization as well. We've still got kakapo, we've still got devils, we can still move them around, we've still got some options. What happens when things go totally extinct? I worked for a while in the Middle East. One of the projects we worked on there was around desert ostriches. In Saudi Arabia, there used to be an Arabian ostrich. And by the early 1900s, it was reduced to kind of two populations, one in the south, one in the north. And by 1950 or so, those populations have gone extinct. Ostriches do interesting things in deserts. They kind of interesting for seed dispersal and other things. The idea was to try and recreate those functions back in the desert, but we didn't have any Arabian ostriches. So the approach was to use ostriches from Sudan, really as these kind of ecological proxies or surrogates. The biggest example of doing this is with giant tortoises. So this is Lonesome George. Well, really it's David Attenborough and Lonesome George. Lonesome George is a male Pinta Island tortoise from the Galapagos who was hatched in about 1910 and died in about 2012. Lonesome George was called Lonesome George because he was the last of his species. And when he went extinct, that was it for the Pinta Island giant tortoise. Giant tortoises in these systems do really important things. The way they trample and the way they graze, they create a habitat called tortoise turf. And it encourages native species and it discourages weedy species. So when you have an extinction, you lose that kind of trampling, grazing function, and invasive weedy species can start to predominate. So to address that as a concern, people have introduced giant tortoises from other parts of the world, Seychelles, Madagascar, Galapagos, to recreate this function. So they're doing that same kind of thing. We don't have the original. We need to find some sort of surrogate. So we can think about a second kind of conservation introduction, an ecological replacement, where the idea is to perform an ecological function lost by the extinction of some original form. Probably the most grandiose or provocative idea for ecological replacement was suggested a number of years ago. A lot of these large mega vertebrates. Perhaps we could restore North American landscapes by bringing in their functional equivalents or ecological equivalents from other parts of the world. I think they were being more provocative than serious, but it created an interesting debate. And of course, what would be the best solution to an extinction where you need to have a species back rather than finding some other kind of species, would be to bring back the species that got lost. So we're seeing a kind of an emergence of this idea of species de-extinction, so-called de-extinction because it's not really. I'm not going to go into detail on that. It's a whole other talk, but it's an interesting area where genomic and genetic technology is massively expanding our conservation toolbox in ways that we can't fully anticipate at the moment. I want to talk a bit about rewilding now. So rewilding as a term was first used back in 1992. It is time to rewild North America. It's past time to reweave the full fabric of life on our continent. A very general statement, but it was operationalized by two conservation pioneers, Reed Noss and Michael Soule, in 1998. And they imagined it in a way that's been given a shorthand of cause, corridors, and carnivores. So rewilding in its original conception was the idea of putting top order predators back into large areas of interconnected wilderness. What we've seen in recent years is that rewilding has become kind of all things to all people. But as a term, it's really caught on. There are rewilding projects and rewilding institutes and rewilding-based NGOs right throughout the world at the moment. And it's gained a lot of credibility, it's gained a lot of interest, and it's moved very far away from that cause corridors and carnivores idea. But people are proposing it as, the solution to the global environmental emergency. And if people like David Attenborough are saying we must rewild the world, then we probably need to take it seriously. The trouble is no one quite knows what rewilding is now. It's shifted from that original. So we could imagine a spectrum of rewilding things, from rewilding in its original conception, weird things like Pleistocene rewilding that Josh Donlan was suggesting, or these other two, which have been called passive rewilding. So where you take some area that maybe it was agricultural land at one stage, and you just leave it alone, and you let it go wild, fill up with whatever it fills up with, native or exotic species. Or you might take a more direct hand in it, something people call translocation rewilding, where you're actually deciding to put the missing species back in there. Recently, I had a go at harmonizing the three fields, what seemed like three fields. So conservation translocations on one side, rewilding, and ecological restoration. As an aside, it's kind of interesting that ecological restoration and reintroductions and conservation translocations are separate things. They've kind of progressed pretty separately. If we look on the conservation translocation side, we can see the things I've been talking about there, population restorations, reintroductions, reinforcements, things like this. And our focus as reintroduction biologists is to find the best bits of habitat that we can put species back into. If we go over to the ecological restoration side, their focus is on restoring damaged or degraded ecosystems. They're looking at poor areas to start with. And the traditional focus there has been putting these abiotic elements back in, putting water back into systems or fire regimes. And if there's any other kind of biotic element, it tends to be revegetation and just letting the animals find their own way there. If we look at the rewilding section, we can divide that up into two things. So this passive rewilding, where you just limit human actions, you just kind of step away and you let species find their own way back there, or something that we'd call trophic rewilding. And I think the trophic rewilding is where we find an intersection between all these three things. So we think about trophic rewilding as really multi-species reintroductions and ecological replacements to restore ecosystem functions. So you might be dealing with one species, you might be dealing with multiple species, but your focus is really much more on restoring that ecosystem. There are strong reasons for doing this. There's a very recent paper came out talking about how we can actually be addressing some of the climate issues through this trophic rewilding. So the idea that wild animals at significant densities, if you get that abundance back again, you can actually enhance the carbon capture and storage by what they call animating the carbon cycle. And this kind of restoration of animal function roles can actually lead to negative emissions. So they're proposing it could be used to turn ecosystems from carbon sources to carbon sinks. And the paper actually does reference otter as one of these kind of species possibilities. We can bring all this together in this one diagram. So this kind of revised conservation translocation spectrum. There are really two parts to it. So on the left, we've got translocation for species conservation, and on the right, translocation for rewilding. If we look at the left, translocation for species conservation, the focus there is improving the status of that species. And that was for long the traditional focus of reintroductions. You've got some critically endangered species. It's been lost from part of its indigenous range. You want to restore that population, those populations, by creating new populations where you can. So you're doing reinforcements, reintroductions rather, or propping up small populations that are in decline, might be doing reinforcements, or you might be moving them into new habitat to protect them from threats within their range, doing an assisted colonization. But your focus is very much on that species and doing what you can for that species. Over on the right, translocation for rewilding, where the focus might be to restore natural ecosystem functions or processes. And you might do this through reintroduction, but the species that you reintroduce might not necessarily be critically endangered or in particular trouble, but it's a really good way to restore a lost process. An example here is the grey wolf, and we can think of things like return of wolves to places like Yellowstone. So wolves aren't particularly endangered throughout the world, but missing within systems, you lose that top predator. So putting top predators back into those systems can recreate some sort of balance. Or where you have a species that's gone extinct, but it did something useful, you might be doing an ecological replacement, finding some near relative, ideally, and putting them back. So with all this, where does the otter reintroduction sit? So it's a focal animal project. You've got a species that is threatened, at least regionally, so threatened under the Oregon Endangered Species Act, and is missing from a part of its indigenous range, so that area from Northern California up to almost Washington, is kind of absent from them, and their abilities or the process for natural recolonization might be limited in there. So you clearly say there's a focal animal focus, because you've got an endangered species that needs to go back into where it used to be. So it sounds like a reintroduction. But it's more than that, because sea otters do interesting things. And there's a couple of pathways where you can actually think about sea otters restoring a balance to a natural system. First one was mentioned at the start, where you lose the predators of sea urchins, you lose that ability to regulate their populations. They become super abundant and overgraze things like the kelp forest. So restoring that predator reduces that abundance, allows you to recover kelp. And same thing with seagrass. It's a little more complicated steps in there, in that you have otters which would eat crabs, which would, without a predator, would be overabundant. Crabs are eating the slugs that would regulate the algal epiphytes, the grazers of algal epiphytes, which would smother the grasses. So there's just another link in there. But clearly sea otters, you could consider them to be a fairly keystone species. Putting them back into those systems is restoring that ecological balance. So we just summarize it all by saying the mission to restore a healthy population of sea otters to Oregon coast and thereby make Oregon's marine and coastal ecosystem more robust and resilient. This is a reintroduction for species conservation and trophic rewilding. So you're ticking a couple of boxes there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Phil. That was super fascinating. I learned a lot. That bat bomb story was crazy. Holy cow, I'm happy that didn't happen.
Yeah, it's not too bad.
Wow. Okay, well, thank you for those who have submitted some questions in the Q&A. If something popped up in your mind that you'd like to ask Phil, please use that Q&A feature on Zoom. All right, first question. How do you lower the risk of reintroduction or relocation? And kind of along those lines, how do you determine an ideal relocation site? Probably just generally speaking.
Yeah, really important. And it comes down to knowing the natural history of your animal, the ecology of your animal. One of the biggest causes of translocation failure or reintroduction failure, I mentioned those high reintroduction failure rates. One of the biggest causes was we called a habitat mismatch, where people are moving them into an area which they feel might be suitable because it kind of looks the same, but it might be actually missing some critical elements, or it has some other elements in there that are not favorable for that species. One of those elements might be the actual original cause of decline. So one of the first things you need to think about is, why is the species being lost from this area in the first place? What were the risk factors there? Can you address them? Can you get rid of them? Because there's absolutely no point putting things back into an area if you're just going to lose them again. So everything might be there and intact, but there might be a threat factor that's a real problem. So understanding why the original decline is the first part of it. Second part is understanding what that species needs to survive and thrive and breed at all age stages and at all parts of the year. So the more you know, we come back to natural history, the more you know about that species, the better.
Great, thank you. Patricia asks, what arguments have you used in New Zealand that have helped government agencies and even business leaders understand that translocation to rebalance biodiversity benefits us all?
I think it's some of it is reconnection with nature. So what we call our native species are what we call taonga species. So for the New Zealand Maori, there are natural history treasures. And we have a number of community-led ecological restoration projects. We call them mainland islands or eco-sanctuaries, where we've removed our main threat to species, which is these invasive predators, by having predator-proof fences around significant areas. And then you can start to reintroduce the lost birds and reptiles and even invertebrates back into those areas. And they become a little slice of what New Zealand should look like, and highly accessible to the public. People can go in there and reset their expectations of what the natural world around them should look like, and then become ambassadors for a more natural world. We very quickly become used to kind of an impoverished environment around us. It's not natural that forests are silent. They should be filled with birdsong. But if all you've known is silent forests, you don't miss what you don't know. So to reset people's expectations, I think, has been very important. That has really been the approach that's let us move into what we call a predator-free initiative. So New Zealand has this very ambitious program backed by government funding to try and get rid of a select number of species of predators. So the Australian brush-tailed possum, rats, stoats, ferrets, weasels. We're supposedly going to get rid of them all from all of New Zealand by 2050. Ambitious, yes. We might make some big inroads on possums. I'm not sure about the others. We've got a lot of remote areas of New Zealand. But that kind of thing's only come because of these kind of smaller scale restorations that's let the public, say, actually, we want these things back. These are our treasures. We want them back. If you don't see them, you don't miss them. If you don't know them, you won't be an advocate for them.
Great, thank you. Let's see if you can help with this question. What's the impact of human marine mammal conflict, such as with human conflict with seals and sea lions that there are currently on the Oregon coast, with successful translocation reintroduction of a species like a sea otter would utilize in similar habitat?
Really challenging, because what you're trying to do ultimately is come back to some sort of natural balance. But when you're doing a reintroduction, you start off with a small founder group, which is really vulnerable to interactions with what might be natural predation or competition events. Slightly different example on New Zealand coast, just 20 minutes away from where I am at the moment. We have endemic yellow-eyed penguins. So it's a penguin species that breeds along the coast here. It's not a reintroduction, but it's a natural recolonization of New Zealand sea lions. So they breed down in the subantarctic. The population's been growing on the mainland, so we've now got breeding individuals. And the occasional sea lion will eat the occasional penguin, and the penguins aren't terribly numerous. And as the sea lions become more numerous, there's been these discussions about, should we be controlling sea lions, or should we be protecting them some way? The idea at the moment is to try and let them kind of meet their own kind of balance And I think that's probably sensible in this case. I think where you have a reintroduction, you need to do everything you can to give your founder population a chance to kind of establish and persist and get into the kind of abundance that you need. Challenging, no easy answers. Yeah.
Great. Another question. Thank you, everyone is submitting some wonderful questions today. Can you reintroduce a species to control an invasive species?
Absolutely. I'm racking my brain to think of a good example, but I think that's true. Sometimes the restoration of predatory species might be the best way to control invasive species. And it's been a suggestion that things like Tasmanian devils or even the thylacine, Tasmanian tiger, if you could ever bring them back in some kind of way, that would address the problem of invasive red foxes in Australia, just because they're natural competitors for these things. Wolves would outcompete foxes and things in some areas in the Middle East, for example. So yeah, there definitely would be possibilities here. Again, you're trying to anticipate what those relationships would look like in a very changed environment. So it would be a case of proceeding pretty carefully, I think. But the idea of native species, natural species, endemic species, even doing your biocontrol for you, yeah, really good one, a really strong argument for the restoration of these things.
Yeah, there's in Oregon, we've got an invasive crab species, the green crab. So I think that's also could be a benefit of reintroducing them, is to control that invasive green crab population, hopefully down the line. Let's see. In regards to trophic rewilding, how does the cost per unit of outcome compare to bottom-up restoration?
Clearly, it's going to be more expensive. If any kind of conservation translocation is an expensive, intensive thing, and it really commits you to long-term involvement. It's justified where there is no alternative. So if you can restore habitat and species can naturally recolonize, that would be the ideal. That's the perfect. In a lot of cases, there are significant barriers to natural colonization, just maybe inappropriate habitat or built up areas or other kind of disturbance. So you actually need to facilitate that through a translocation. It's going to be more expensive. So I think the first thing is to understand where the natural colonization might be possible. There were, I know, a project in Australia for the Australian bustard where they actually went to a lot of effort to create a reserve that would be a release site for a reintroduction program they were going to set up. And they created this reserve and they got the habitat all nice, and they were just about to start the captive breeding program when the bustards found their way in anyway. So they went, well, don't need to do that, saved a lot of money.
Great. I'm just doing a time check. We have about 5 minutes left. So I have a lot of questions. So sorry if I don't get to yours, but I'm just trying to stay on track here. Let's see. How many species reintroductions have had negative effect on human community sustenance from the ecosystem?
Fairly few, but it does exist. I think there are concerns where you have species that have big effects on environment. So these kind of top order predators, a lot of people are concerned about predatory species going back into areas, not necessarily for human welfare, but for livestock. So the idea of, bringing wolves back or lynx, or people are talking about, things like bears in some areas. So there are legitimate concerns over livestock, where you have keystone species like otter or like beaver in the United Kingdom, where they can change their environment in fairly significant ways and cause flooding of some areas in the short term. The long term, it's considered to be benefit to have it, but you do get pushback because people are kind of losing land or losing livelihoods or are concerned that they might lose land and livelihoods. I think when you burrow down, amongst the many species that have been moved and released for conservation purposes, there are relatively few that have had significant long-term impacts on human health or livelihoods.
I guess along those lines, another question is, how do you get people to embrace a reintroduction of a species that might negatively, maybe at first, impact their income, like the fishing and crabbing community? We get a lot of questions and concerns about that in terms of reintroduction. So is there any comments you have for that?
I think if the idea is to bring something back to restore natural habitats, you would look at what the result of having an improved kelp forest or seagrass beds might be for the marine production base that sits within those areas. It's the same arguments around marine protected areas, where people are saying we're losing productive fishing grounds. But we know from a number of cases around the world, including in New Zealand, where a marine protected area will create a kind of a halo effect of increased fish abundance, just because it's allowed that area to recover and restore those natural systems. So I think understanding that and communicating that would be a good way around it. It may be short-term pain for long-term gain. The other point, I think, really important one, you've got to get the community on side. None of these things work unless you have people that are pushing for it and working for it. So making all the stakeholders in an area partners within the project, sometimes a bit reluctantly at first, but understanding more about what that system's going to do and how it's going to change. Yeah.
I love that answer. Very wonderfully put. Is there a common reason why some reintroductions fail?
Yeah, I talked about this habitat mismatch. So people put them into the wrong area because they don't understand the full requirements for a species. People might release too few animals. So it might be a good area, have a chance, but if you have a small founding population, just by chance, some animals will die or move away. Dispersal is a big problem. You put them into what you think is a really good area and you focus your attention on that area, and the animals decide to go somewhere else and they move themselves out into areas of harm. Lack of long-term commitment and funding for these things has been a problem as well. People are all keen, when you're doing a captive breeding and you do a release, it's all very visual and you get everyone on board. When the animals are out there in that environment and they might be at low abundance, they might be quite cryptic, people aren't seeing them, there's less kind of interest. But you really, once you do a reintroduction, there's a long-term commitment for kind of intensive and focused post-release monitoring to really understand what's happening with that population. Otherwise, we've seen a number of examples back in the past where people released a whole lot of animals and then came back 10 years later and there were none there, and they went, oh, well, that failed. We don't know why. We don't know if it learned nothing from it.
Yeah, we there's some questions in here about the 1970s sea otter reintroduction here in Oregon. And why that failed. And we actually, Bob Bailey, our board president, just created a whole presentation regarding that reintroduction that will showcase in the next couple of months on a webinar. So stay tuned for that so you can learn everything about that translocation. And it is 1 o'clock on the dot. So Phil, I'll ask you one more question and we'll close it at that. What fuels your passion for wildlife conservation?
Just seeing things back where they need to be. I think immersing yourself in nature. We're naturally biophilic. I think it's there's more and more scientific evidence, if we needed that being in nature makes us feel good. And what better nature to be in than the nature that should be in the area that you stand. So immersing yourself in the right plants and the right animals in the right place, refreshing, renewing.
Wonderful. Well, on behalf of the Elakha Alliance and Defenders of Wildlife, thank you so much for spending some time with us today and answering all of these fantastic questions. This was super educational, and hopefully we'll get you to come back soon for another follow-up webinar when we get otters in the water.
Love to. My pleasure. And thank you very much for having me.
Sure thing. Thanks everyone for joining
Thanks much,
us.
Phil. Thanks for coming.